Welcome to Study Session 14, International Case Studies of Conflict and Conflict Resolution. Introduction. In this study session, you will apply theories to cases, some key international conflicts and the negotiation or resolution techniques will be our focus. Learning outcomes. At the end of this study session, you should be able to 1. Write a seminal paper on any international conflict that has been resolved by the United Nations. 2. Draw up your own proposal on how to resolve an ongoing international conflict that you are familiar with. Ethnic tension and conflicts. Ethnic tension and conflicts constitute a defining characteristic of the post-Cold War world. As already pointed out, the causes of war or conflict can be placed within the framework of individual, state, and international levels of analysis. However, the inevitability of these wars does not say that global society should not enjoy peace. The international norm of peaceful settlement is set forth in the Article 2, Paragraph 1 of the UN Charter, which states, "All members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered." Essentially, most of the common procedures for settlement of international disputes are listed in Article 33, Paragraph 1 of the UN Charter. The parties to any dispute, the continuance of which is likely to engender the maintenance of international peace and security, shall first of all seek the solution by negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies or arrangements, or other peaceful means of their choice. Disputes before the United Nations have had a variety of courses, but during the several decades of the Cold War, they involved controversies between the East and West, conflict produced by decolonization process, questions relating to territory and boundaries, and disputes arising from intervention by one or more states in the internal quarrels of another. In this sense, the post-Cold War world, through UN, has resulted in a series of conflict resolution, stemming primarily from internal conflict rather than external intervention. In this study session, case studies of some international conflicts or disputes resolved by the UN will be analyzed. South Africa. South Africa racial policies dominated UN discussion and debates more than any other issue throughout the 1980s. South Africa's discrimination against minorities first came before the General Assembly in 1946. The complaint was brought by India, alleging South African violation of the Cape Town Agreements of 1927 and 1932, which guaranteed equality of treatment for each other's resident nationals. The Indian complaint was never resolved, and it was a perennial subject of assembly discussions and resolutions until it was merged in 1950s with a broader attack on South African racial discrimination, focusing on the policy of apartheid, or separation of whites from the non-white majority. You must note that the major objective of sustained UN condemnation of apartheid was to isolate South Africa from the world community and ultimately to force the Afrikaner government to abolish the practice. In 1962, the Assembly created a special committee against apartheid to gather information about apartheid and make sure the issue remained a priority in the Assembly and the world at large. When South Africa persistently refused to heed Assembly demands to abandon its apartheid policies, the Assembly responded with increasingly bitter denunciation, repeatedly urging members to call all political and economic ties with South Africa and call on the Security Council to impose mandatory sanctions. In 1973, an international convention on the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid was opened for signature. In 1976, the Assembly began explicitly to advocate armed struggle in South Africa as a means of eradicating the evil. Through the decade of the 1980s, apartheid system remained largely intact. In 1982, in response to growing external pressures, South Africa introduced modest reforms, including a tricameral legislature which separates chambers for whites, Indians and coloreds, people of mixed race. The changes gave no political right to blacks and left the white minority in control. Meanwhile, the government used the full force of criminal law, including the death penalty, against internal opponents of apartheid. Members of the anti-apartheid African National Congress (ANC) were the most frequent targets. The world reaction to apartheid regime was improving. Between 1989 and 1992, the UN General Assembly removed a ban on South African participation in international sporting, scientific and cultural activities and advised members to consider ending other sanctions as circumstances warranted. The European Community scrapped its oil embargo, and the United States ended restrictions on economic contact with South Africa. As a matter of fact, sustained pressure and economic sanctions were deemed successful when political reforms were introduced in the country that permitted elections in which each adult South African, white and black, voted in 1994 for a government of his or her choice. Thus, Nelson Mandela's victory and his inauguration as President of South Africa marked the end of a long, tedious ordeal. The UN role in the political and social transformation of South Africa was pivotal. Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. The Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts have been a perennial concern of the UN almost from the inception of the organization. To briefly trace the origins of the problems, diaspora Jews living mostly in Eastern Europe formed the World Zionist Organization under the leadership of Theodor Herzl towards the close of the 19th century, calling for a Jewish homeland or state where Jews could practice their traditions free from persecution. The movement centered its attention on a return to Zion, that is, to their biblical source of identity, in modern times often referred to as Palestine. The UN General Assembly recommended partition of the Palestine Mandate into separate Arab and Jewish states, each politically independent but forming an economic union. Arab opposition altered the peaceful implementation of this partition plan, however, and after a military struggle, the Palestinians were defeated and Israel was established in 1948. The independent Arab states, however, within moments of Israel's declaration of independence, attacked the new country. The war they fought, however, was not without its innocent victims. Palestinian Arab refugees who had fled in droves rather than live in a Jewish state regarded the Israelis as imperialists. Arab nationalists everywhere took up the cause, declaring a holy war against Zionism and vowing to destroy the newborn state of Israel. Surprisingly, Israel prevailed over the invading Arab states and extended its control and ultimately its sovereignty over a broader area than that described in the original UN resolution. Subsequently, a UN mediator was able to secure a ceasefire and a truce. Later, 4 armistice agreements were concluded. Since that time, no annual session of the General Assembly has been free from the conflict between Arabs, Jews, and the Palestinians. The issues confronting the UN have all centered on the aftermath of Arab defeats in their several wars with Israel. Prominent among them have been refugee relief and resettlement, claimed Arab property rights in Israel, Israeli human rights violations, and after 1967, Israeli occupation of Arab territories, especially the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Syrian Golan Heights. Also important has been the status of Jerusalem, the creation of an independent Arab-Palestinian state, and a host of security questions stemming from terror tactics employed by Arab states and organizations against the Jewish state. The Security Council has also been heavily involved in the Arab-Israeli and Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Major hostilities have erupted during nearly every decade since 1948 to 49 war for Israel independence. In 1956, Egyptian nationalization of Suez Canal provided the occasion for an invasion of Egypt by Britain and France, and subsequently by Israel. In 1967, the Six-Day War, Israel launched a crushing military strike against Egypt to remove the threat of its security from Egypt, supported guerrillas, and to maintain use of the Gulf of Aqaba for its trade and commerce. A UN force stationed at Sharm el-Sheikh after 1956 war to guarantee Israel's use of the Gulf of Aqaba had been removed abruptly by UN Secretary General U Thant. In the 1967 war, Israel occupied the Sinai up to Suez Canal. Jordan lost control of the West Bank territory it had seized in the 1948-1949 war, and Syria was pushed off the Golan Heights. In 1973, called the Yom Kippur War by Israeli and the Ramadan War by Arabs, Egypt and Syria struck the initial blow against Israel in hope of regaining territory lost in 1967 war. In 1978 and again in 1982, Israeli forces initiated major hostilities in Lebanon in response to Palestinian raids into Israel over the Lebanese border. More importantly, Security Council resolutions have established certain principles to which all the participants repeatedly refer in the Middle East negotiations. Security Council Resolution 242, adopted unanimously on November 22, 1967, in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, is by far the most important. Its two cardinal principles are: 1. Israeli withdrawal from territories occupied in the recent conflicts, and 2. Respect for and acknowledgement of the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of every state in the area, and their right to live in peace within secure and recognized boundaries. Although the UN General Assembly failed to reflect the dramatic turn in the Arab-Israeli conflict, but its negotiation strategy over the years has received a tremendous support globally. However, at Oslo in 1993, the Israeli government chose to recognize and make a pact with the Palestine Liberation Organization (PLO) to the exclusion of and against Hamas. The Oslo Agreement gave birth to the Palestine Authority governing an autonomous Palestinian area. After 2006 election that brought Hamas to power, some movement has begun to negotiate a new and fuller pact between the PLO and Israel, again to the exclusion of Hamas. Security Council appointed a UN Commission on India and Pakistan to investigate and mediate the Kashmir dispute. After months of negotiation, the UN Commission on India and Pakistan, UNCIP, was able to secure a truce and ceasefire effective January 1, 1949, and an acceptance in principle of a plebiscite to resolve the accession question. However, renewed fighting between India and Pakistan shattered the truce in Kashmir. Diplomacy, whether organized by the UN or independent of it, was still limited by events, and there was little promise that a solution to the problem of Kashmir would be found. Nevertheless, despite continuing assaults in Kashmir by terrorist organizations, a breakthrough of sorts occurred in January 2004 when the Pakistani president and the Indian Prime Minister met in Islamabad and agreed to a formal ceasefire in Kashmir. The two leaders agreed to conduct high-level negotiations on Kashmir, as well as seek ways to normalize communications and commerce between their countries. South Pacific, East Timor. United Nations concern for the people of East Timor were somewhat reduced when Indonesia's post-Suharto government ceased its aggressive campaign against the Timorese people. In the summer of 1998, Jakarta moved its troops and agreed to conduct elections in an effort to restore tranquility and self-government to the island. Seizing the opportunity to press for a resolution of the Timorese problem, Secretary General Kofi Annan named a personal representative on East Timor to work with the parties. In 1999, the representative Jamshid Marka reported progress in his negotiations, and an agreement to hold a direct ballot in Timor was obtained from the Indonesian government. In effect, the people of East Timor were to be given the option of accepting or rejecting a proposal of autonomy. Secretary General Annan cited his continuing concern but welcomed the positive atmosphere of the negotiations as well as the statements by the parties that their objective was peace and stability on the island. The election results indicated the heavy presence of the East Timorese for independence. Those opposed to the move, however, was not to be reconciled. Fighting broke out that required an international force led by Australia. In the ensuing battles, the Indonesian forces gave up the fight, and in due course, peace was restored, but at a considerable price in death and destruction. United Nations Mission of Support in East Timor, UNIMISET, was sent to the island in May 2002 to help guide the new state, now officially known as Timor-Leste. Summary of study session. In this study session, you learned that the 20th century witnessed many conflicts and wars in various parts of the world. Some of the causes of these conflicts can be explained within the framework of individual state and international levels of analysis. In line with the UN principle of maintaining international peace and security, some of these conflicts have been resolved. The theoretical explanation of negotiation, mediation, adjudication, and reconciliation were put into practice in resolving international conflicts by the UN. Examples are drawn from apartheid regime in South Africa, the Middle East conflict involving the Israeli and Arabs, and Israeli and the Palestinians, the India-Pakistan conflict over Kashmir, and Indonesian aggression over the East Timorese. We have come to the end of post 455. Thank you.